Hello everyone, and welcome to the Biblical Bookworm. My name is Elizabeth, and let me start this way. Maybe you've been wondering this Lent already why on earth you have to fast. Maybe you don't see any point in those little sufferings and sacrifices you have to make this Lent, and you're getting impatient. Or maybe you're just interested in a summary of the book Ascent of Mount Carmel, because either way, you're watching the right video. Because in this video, I will summarize the book Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross, and this summary will also answer the question why on earth you have to fast. You see, St. John of the Cross wrote about many different topics in this particular book, and generally speaking, the book is a guide to union with God, so a guide to holiness. But what I found most interesting and useful were the chapters where he writes about the potential dangers of rejoicing in temporal goods, and where he describes the benefits we can derive from detaching ourselves from those temporal goods. So temporal goods would be, for example, riches, rank, office, children, relatives, and marriages. And then he also talks about rejoicing in spiritual or moral goods. So that will be, for example, consolation in prayer. And here he also describes the dangers, and he writes that the dangers of delighting in holy things can be even more severe than delighting in temporal things, because people don't realize that they get attached to a spiritual consolation, for example, and they don't realize that it, for example, keeps them from material recollection. St. John of the Cross explains that holiness consists in one thing: knowing how to deny oneself. So you see where we're going with this. Fasting is an exercise of detachment, and St. John of the Cross explains why that is so necessary. Now, St. John talks about the 6 sources from which joy can arise, and those are temporal, natural, sensual, moral, supernatural, and spiritual. Regarding temporal sources of joy, he explains that while they are not inherently sinful, our attachment to them can lead us to neglect our relationship with God, which is a sin. The only circumstance where it is meritorious to rejoice in temporal things is when those things are used in the service of God, and in every other case they are not inherently sinful, but they might be a problematic distraction. Then he talks about what evils can come from rejoicing in temporal blessings, and he writes that if he had to describe them all, neither ink nor paper would suffice. What all of those evils have in common is that they all stem from the withdrawal from God. So again, the main problem of temporal blessings is that they distract you from the things that really matter. There are 4 degrees of those evils. The first degree is the blunting with regard to God and clouding of the judgment. The second degree is what he calls dilation of the will, which means that people no longer attach much importance to spiritual things and they don't trouble themselves with those matters. The third degree is that we neglect to fulfill God's law and relapse into mortal sin. And the fourth and last degree is that the soul forgets about God and departs from him with the memory, the understanding, and the will. And now the new God of that person is money. The benefits that come to the soul if it withdraws from joy from temporal things are first that it frees the soul from the evils I just described, and it gives the soul the virtue of liberality, which can't coexist with covetousness. St. John also writes that this person will find greater joy and recreation in the creatures through this detachment, because it's impossible to really rejoice in something one is attached to. Another source of joy I'd like to touch upon in this video are natural blessings, which are, for example, beauty, grace, bodily constitution, and all other bodily endowments. The 6 evils that can come from rejoicing in natural goods are vainglory, presumption, pride, and disesteem of our neighbor. The second evil is the, quote, moving of the senses to complacency and sensual delight and lust. The third evil is falling into adulation and vain praise. The fourth evil is a serious blunting of the reason and the spiritual sense, so the same as with the temporal goods described before. And the fifth evil is distraction of the mind by created things. And finally, the sixth evil is lukewarmness and weakness of spirit. After that, St. John writes about the benefits the soul receives from not setting its rejoicing upon the good things of nature. First, it prepares the soul for the love of God and the other virtues. It helps acquire humility and charity toward one's neighbors. And another benefit is that it fulfills and keeps the counsel of our Savior, which he gave us through St. Matthew. Let him that will follow me deny himself. So that's Matthew 16:24. Another benefit of the renunciation of this rejoicing in natural goods is that it produces great tranquility in the soul, so a certain peace and calmness. It gets rid of distractions and helps recollect the senses, especially the eyes. Then he also describes specific evils that can come from each of the 5 senses, which I'm not going to talk about in detail, but you can read it up online. Just to give you an example, from joy in hearing, for example, 2 of the evils are envy and gossiping, so you get the idea, I guess. And the benefits that can come from detachment from those goods are, for example, recollection. Now I'd like to talk about rejoicing in moral and spiritual goods, which are particularly important to keep in mind because the dangers that those joys contain are often overlooked because people don't suspect religious practices to be harmful in any way. But they can become problematic when we, for example, only pray because it gives us spiritual consolation. That's when the dark night of the soul becomes necessary, about which I've made a video last week or in the last video, because in that dark night we don't experience consolation in prayer, for example, and so that gives us the opportunity to learn to love God for Himself and not for the pleasures He can give us. Let's clarify first what other examples of moral goods there are. So, according to St. John, that would be rejoicing in one's good works and habits. The first evil here is vanity, pride, vainglory, and presumption. That's all one category. The second evil is usually linked with the first one because we tend to judge others by comparing ourselves with them and realizing that we, for example, pray a lot more than they. And maybe you remember the story in Luke 18:10-14, which perfectly illustrates that. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a despised tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer. I thank you, God, that I'm not like other people, cheaters, sinners, adulterers. I'm certainly not like that tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give you the 10th of my income. But the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. I tell you, this sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Okay, the third evil is that as they look for pleasure in their good works, they usually do them only when they see that some pleasure and praise will result from them, and they don't want to work for the love of God alone. The fourth evil is that they will have no reward from God because they have desired to have joy and consolation and honor or some other kind of interest in this life as a result of their good works, and so they have already received their just pay on this earth. The fifth evil is that such persons don't make any progress on the road of perfection because people don't persevere as soon as they stop deriving any pleasure from their good works. The sixth evil is that such people oftentimes are in the misbelief that the works that give them pleasure are better than the ones that they don't enjoy doing. And in fact, the opposite is true, because if they, for example, pray in spite of not enjoying it, that's actually more meritorious than if they enjoyed it. The seventh evil is that rejoicing in moral goods makes us incapable of receiving reasonable counsel and instruction regarding good works that we should perform. And finally, I'll talk about the benefits from detaching from the joys those moral goods can bring. To keep that part short, it keeps people from certain temptations. Then another benefit is that the good works can be performed with a greater perfection, and that detachment also helps with humility, of course. That's been my summary on what St. John writes about detachment, and I hope that it helps you understand why some sort of fasting during Lent is necessary and beneficial. And as I said at the beginning of this video, detachment is not the only topic in the book. The descriptions are just relatively detailed there, and I found them to be helpful during Lent. A last thing from the book I'd like to summarize is what St. John writes about prophecies and visions and stuff like that. That doesn't really fit the topic before, but I found it really interesting, so I'd like to summarize that as well. Okay, so one really interesting thing St. John writes is that real visions from God tend to surprise people with their actual meaning, which proves that they were not man-made because people can't guess their meaning. He also explains that God's prophecies can be conditional. So if a prophecy, for example, foresees some tragic event that is supposed to punish a certain sin, and at some point that sin ceases, so the moral situation improves, the punishing event won't happen, so in that sense the prophecy was not fulfilled. And finally, he reminds his readers that virtue doesn't consist in apprehensions, and generally it doesn't have anything to do with feelings, but it's all a matter of humility. Now let's get to my opinion on the book. I would give the book an 8 out of 10, and please understand that when I give this ranking, I'm not judging the abstract quality of the text, because I've read somewhere that the text is one of the most well-known or the best texts in Spanish literature, so I'm not doubting that. I'm just saying that for a modern reader, for a modern Catholic reader, the book might not be that helpful as maybe The Dark Night of the Soul, because I found it a little bit difficult to understand what St. John means by certain things, and in general to understand what he's talking at a certain point. So that's why the rating is only an 8 out of 10. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. See you next week. God bless and bye!